If you made something that looks cool on PC and consoles, it's almost always impossible to take the same thing and then move it to mobile. You need to develop an art style that looks good. There are a couple of different art you could do that with. A lot of people do like... A big thing I've done in my games is...
Welcome to a new episode of XR and AI Spotlight, the show where we give the stage to the founders and makers pushing the boundaries of XR and AI. My name is Gabriele Romagnoli, I'm your host, and I'm here today with Oskar Stålberg. Oskar is an established indie game developer and a real authority when it comes to procedural content generation. He has worked on Tom Clancy The Division and later focused on his own titles like Bad North and Townscaper, both acclaimed successes by the gaming community. Oskar has also ported Townscaper to MetaQuest and keeps finding new and creative ways to leverage procedural generation for innovative and unconventional game ideas. Join these episodes to learn how he finds the balance between art style and gameplay for some of his most successful games.
If you have very colorful and detailed visuals, it's kind of hard to put a game on top of that because then the gameplay elements kind of drown in all the detail from the environment. So instead I went the complete other way.
The role of the wave function collapse algorithm and how he took procedural generation to a new artistic level.
And then I came across this algorithm called wave function collapse. It's based on an algorithm called model synthesis. I like this kind of approach because a lot of procedural generation techniques will output results that will look very procedurally generated. And this system has a fairly clear division of labor between the algorithm and the artist, because
the reason why he has been building in public and how he managed to gather an audience of over 100,000 followers on Twitter.
Yeah, I've been building in public for a long time, and it's just a good way to see like what kind of things do people respond to, and also to get a sense of like what are the coolest parts of your game, what are the parts that you should be using more when it's time to do like proper marketing.
And how he reimagined Townscaper for standalone virtual reality.
The big thing about VR is the interaction is completely different. That was sort of the fun part about making the VR port, because it's not a super explored area and there's like people do very different things.
But before we get into it, I wanted to thank our sponsor Meshi, who made this episode possible. Meshi is a real powerhouse for generating 3D assets with AI. You can start with a simple text or image prompt and get high quality stylized model in just a minute. One feature that I personally love is the ability to create stylized textures for any mesh with or without UV, and since the release of Meshing 2.5, pro users can even edit only section of the generated textures with just a text prompt. Try it out, go to meshi.ai, start the 7 days trial, and after that, use the code XRAI20 to get 20% off your subscription. And now it's time to welcome Oskar under the spotlight. Oskar, it is a real pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I am a big fan, like many more, of the work that you're sharing around gameplay, creating procedural content, and in general, your whole journey. So I wanted to start asking you, what inspired you to create Townscaper, and how did the concept evolve over time?
So it's a fairly long story. Townscaper is in many ways like it's kind of a tech demo and an artistic demo, in the sense that some time ago I came across. I'd been thinking a lot about how to do procedural houses, because that was the thing in The Division, the game I worked on a long time ago. It takes place in New York, so there's a lot of buildings, and there was a lot of like semi-procedural generation of the building, not like full procedural like the stuff I'm doing, but a lot of tools needed to be developed to make those buildings. And I didn't work on those tools, but I kind of saw it happening, and it got me thinking of procedural generation in buildings, and started thinking about like what are the patterns in buildings, what things are repeatable, what things are regular, how do things fit together, stuff like that. And on my spare time, I made a little a little tool that it's called BrickBlock. It's like it looks like a super early version of Townscaper, kind of. The technology is a little bit different, but you can really, like, if you look at it, you can tell that it looks like Townscaper a little bit. And so I came up with a sort of modular idea how little pieces could fit together into a bigger whole. But there were some big questions I had left to solve, like how could you make features that stretch across multiple tiles? So I could make these little puzzle pieces with their own handcrafted little bits and details to them, like little plants or little doors and windows and stuff. But I couldn't make larger features like a roof that spans across like a
garden
or gardens or stuff like that. So that's something I'd been thinking about for a bit. And then I came across this algorithm called, the one I came across was called wave function collapse. It's based on an algorithm called model synthesis. And it wasn't really used in the way that I used it, but I sort of, since I'd been thinking of it, I saw that this could be repurposed to fit what I was thinking about. Like, how could I get more complex features into this, or bigger visual features into this thing? So I started...
I would like maybe also to briefly show a little trailer of what is now the VR version of the game so that people get an impression of how that looks like. So let me maybe show it for 1 minute, a little trailer, so that we also people get more visual representation. Let's do it.
Well, nice. It was a long time since I saw the trailer.
I can imagine a lot of memories. We are going to discuss certainly about the VR port because that's one thing that is particularly fascinating since it was so well implemented. So I wanna dive deeper into that. But before, there was one thing that I felt while you were telling this story, right? It felt it was more of a technical challenge that turned into a game other than an end gameplay idea.
Yes.
So what drive the creation process?
Yeah, well, you stopped the story much earlier than you think as well, because at first I was using this algorithm to create really colorful building environments because I think that's interesting. I like those kind of visuals, but then I couldn't figure out how to turn that into a game. I couldn't figure out a gameplay to put into it. So then instead I made the game Bad North. So I repurposed the visuals to be much more so, because the thing is, if you have very colorful and detailed visuals, it's kind of hard to put a game on top of that because then the gameplay elements kind of drown in all the detail from the environments. So instead, I went the complete other way, and I remade the environment. So instead of beautiful, colorful houses, it was very subtle, grayish environments, which kind of served as a gameplay as a canvas for the gameplay in the game Bad North. But then after Bad North was finished, and Bad North did fairly well, so I didn't feel like I had to come up with a new commercially successful game right away. Then I figured, okay, now I'm going to make these colorful buildings. And even if I don't come up with like a proper gameplay to put on top of it, I'm going to ignore that. I'm just going to make the beautiful buildings with the algorithm and make it a little tool so you can just build yourself. So that's kind of how I started working on Townscaper.
And so, of course, beautiful building resonates more with a creative activity that is, in a way, it's not 3D modeling in any way, but it is about constructing things and beautiful things without a final end goal in the game, right? So how do you then combine that aspect of, let's say, technological challenge or technical challenge with your art skills? How do you manage to combine them together and how do they contribute to each other during the process of creating a game?
And I mean, they contribute a lot to each other. To me, they're kind of one of the same. Like, I think if you didn't have both these kind of skills in your own head, it would be quite difficult to do the things I do, because it would be hard to like start with concept art of Townscaper and then tell the programmer, hey, could you make this game? Or, and likewise on the other end, it would be hard to start with the algorithm without, and then just tell an artist, hey, could you make the art for this game? Because the two work together so closely. Like a big part of the aesthetics come from the algorithm. Like, things need to be kind of chunky and in blocks, which kind of limits what kind of architectural styles would fit well. And also, of course, performance is a very big issue, because this runs on mobile and it runs on the Quest, which are like not very powerful platforms. So all the cool things you can do on PC, you can definitely not do here. So it needs the art style. So I need to develop an art style that is that looks good even on like very low performant devices. I mean, basically the art basically looks the same on phone as on PC.
And by the way, it runs also on web.
Yes.
While I'm browsing online, I've also seen that it works on web, and I think this is, by the way, something that many people are, of course, struggling with in terms of pushing and building games that looks good, but that runs on mobile devices. Is there maybe some advices that you would give to people that are approaching this challenge? Do they have to redesign and reinvent the game so that it works, or there are some things that you have found that works when porting an app like this?
Yeah, it's basically, if you made something that looks cool on PC and consoles, it's almost always impossible to take the same thing and then move it to mobile, for example. Because if you want it to look really good on mobile, you need, or VR, or you need to design with that in mind from the start. Because like the same features won't be available, so you need to be able to play and tweak with the few features that are available to you. So you really need to think about you need to develop an art style that looks good even without those kind of features. And there are a couple of different art styles you could do that with. A lot of people do like flat shaded styles, for example. Those work very well. In my games, I've used a lot of outlines, for example, which is a very convenient art style. It's not too expensive to make. It's a little bit there's some technical like finicky stuff with it, but you can easily make it fairly cheap and super. It's very crisp and readable without having to add a lot of other complex things to make it readable. Also, a big thing I've done in my games is I've written my own lighting solutions, and especially like ambient lighting solutions. Those kind of things are usually like general solutions to those problems are super complex. So like normally in a mobile game, you cannot have like dynamic ambient lighting because that's super expensive. But usually you can come up with a sort of a specialized version of ambient lighting that fits your exact game. So it's not made for a general world that could look in any kind of way. That could be like, a lot of game worlds, they're huge, and they have like some wide areas, and they have some super detailed areas, and they have thin walls separating rooms, for example. So all those things are really difficult to do in a good ambient occlusion solution. But my games, they are very limited in their size, and they're usually built on a grid. So you can kind of leverage the data structure that the game already exists upon. Like the game is already on a grid. It's already based on blocks in the grid. So you can do a lot of the ambient lighting calculations in this much more constrained, less complex world that is already an abstraction of the game that you're working in. So I don't need to ray trace against polygons. I can just ray trace inside this voxel space where the game takes place, which makes for like much cheaper and faster ambient lighting solutions.
And I can imagine that this is not necessarily something that is applicable to everybody or to every game, as you just mentioned. But I would recommend everybody actually that is listening to this and find this interesting to check out Oskar Twitter account, because that is where a lot of these live experiments are taking place. So loving really seeing how these words literally are shaping up. And Can we maybe start discussing a little bit about this procedural generation, right? So you mentioned briefly about wave function collapse, but can you explain to someone that doesn't know much about it in a couple of sentences, how is the procedural generation done in Townscaper? And how did you get inspired to creating this algorithm that simulates something that is procedural, but then it looks always different?
Yeah, so the way the algorithm works in a nutshell is I give it a bunch of sort of puzzle pieces, so little pieces that contains bits of architecture. So imagine if you take a house and then you split it up into small pieces. I build all those little pieces. They're normally called tiles in Gales. And then the algorithm, in one step, it first like analyzes all the edges of those pieces. So like in a puzzle, that would be like it sees which bit sticks out or which bit sticks in. So it knows which pieces fit with which pieces. And then the algorithm can figure out how to create a whole environment where every piece fits with every other piece. And of course, it also needs to, in Townscaper, it needs to adapt to like you click out different blocks. So on each, surrounding each block, it needs to have a sort of polygon skin. So it's quite limited which pieces could fit where. Like maybe there's a couple of corners that could fit. Like there's one with a roof, there's one with like a flat roof, there's one with something else on top. There's a couple of choices it could make, and depending on which choices it makes, other pieces need to be able to fit next to it. So this algorithm basically figures out the complex problem of how do you create a coherent environment out of all these different puzzle pieces you give it. And I like this kind of approach because in procedural generation, there's always things. A lot of procedural generation techniques will output results that will look very procedurally generated. That will look it will look like a programmer made it and not an artist. But this system has a fairly clear division of labor between the algorithm and the artist, because the algorithm just makes sure everything's fit together, but then the artist get to manually build all these little puzzle pieces. So that's where you get to put in a lot of the really thoughtful details. Like in Townscaper, that's all the little mailboxes, the little boots on the doorstep, all those kind of little pieces. So the procedural result doesn't look too sterile. It's always good to have, because procedural generation is incredibly powerful. But if you do like more pure procedural generation with less handcrafted stuff, like for every little thing, like if you would have to write a boot on steps placing algorithm and a flower pot placing algorithm that figures out the best ways to place all these kinds of things, it quickly becomes very unwieldy. Whereas if you leave some stuff to the handcrafting, it's much easier. Just add a little detail here, add a little detail there, and you don't need like to break down everything sort of algorithmically like that. So it's good to have space for both handcrafting and algorithms in procedural.
And I think that is also one of the major gameplay aspects in a way of Townscaper, or at least, right, is this aspect of discovering and let me change color here, but if I add a hole here, what happens? And then there is a string with clothes hanging, or maybe there is one or two. So that is, I think, what also add to the fun and the discovering aspect of the game. Though, so we are saying is that I create all these pieces, tiles, and then the algorithm decides what basically is built based on the intent of the user, prioritizing certain things over others, I can imagine. Yes. Right? So, okay, here, put this kind of, when these two are together, put this first, then other than other options. Now, is that it? Like, how do you really make something that still feels always diverse? How do you create something within that algorithm or build an infrastructure for that algorithm to act so that what's being created doesn't look so procedurally generated but feels more organic?
I mean, that's sort of it. A big part of it is, of course, to add all these little, like there are some parts where it's like it's clearly prioritized which pieces are supposed to end up there. So if it can place a proper roof, a sloped roof, it will always do. But if it can't, it will turn it into a terrace with cobblestones on it. But then there are a bunch of places as well where there's an equal priority between pieces. We will just pick randomly. For example, the chimneys. sometimes a gable has a chimney and sometimes it doesn't. And those two options are the same priority, it just picks randomly. And some of
You're
these,
saying that is really basically a lot of the playing and fine tuning the algorithm. That's one of the core things.
yes, yeah, sort of, yeah. Or not really the algorithm itself, but like the data that goes into the algorithm. So each tile knows what kind of priority it has, and then like weighting those between each other and prioritizing different tiles. Then there's actually an other layer algorithm on top of this. So you have this base wave function collapse algorithm that figures out how all the little puzzle pieces fit together. But then there's another prop placement algorithm that places all the small things. It actually places the windows as well. So all the little puzzle pieces have a bunch of different props that could go on them. So they have like positions where the windows are supposed to be. And if you look at the tiles in Editor, they have a lot more props that could possibly fit on them. So then it kind of randomly picks between them and tries to place as many props as they can without the props overlapping. Because then you get this really lovely cluttered look that looks really cozy. But then there's also some... So this algorithm, it's all about adjacency constraints, which means like how do different pieces fit next to each other. But just with adjacency constraints, you can create some really interesting, intricate things. I think one of the best example of this is the little steel support beams you get in Townscaper. It's really fun to figure out how you create the different shape of those, like how you make those kind of several steel beams can fuse into one, and it tries to create this interesting support network. And all of that is just adjacency constraints, and also the knowledge that the algorithm will start on top, highest up, and then kind of resolve further downward. So you will also usually get these steel beams kind of coalescing into single pillars as it goes downward. Then it's just a few coming all the way down. So it's kind of, once you have worked with the algorithm a while and you have really sort of intimate knowledge of it, you start to figure out interesting ways like that to play with the algorithm, just leveraging the very, very simple rules. Another case is the gardens in Townscaper. So in Townscaper, you make a garden by creating an enclosed space. You build buildings around a little square, and suddenly the cobblestones on the square turns into grass, and it's a garden. And that's also purely adjacency rules. So it's like the gardens are super high priority. So it will always place a garden if it can place a garden. But the gardens, they only have flat pieces and pieces that end against the wall. So there are no pieces with like a garden on top that falls down, down the side of a wall. Yeah. So
and then of course there is fine tuning of these whole variables that I can imagine. It's a lot of
yeah.
trial and error and exploration. What looks good, what doesn't. Yeah. To my knowledge, and I don't know, I might be wrong, right? You have used a lot of these techniques for worlds. I was wondering if you have any thought if there are differences, for example, about something that is more like game levels or assets. Is that something, maybe not the specific function, but maybe other system that use procedural generation for those?
So I don't fully understand the question.
Right. So the wave function collapse is actually used for creating words, right?
Yeah.
So something that is at a scale of a word. It's not a sword, it's not an object.
Right.
It is not necessarily like a game level, for example, right? Because with this roguelite game, there are a lot of these. It's a different problems, and maybe it needs different solutions. So I was wondering if your expertise in building Townscaper or other games can be ported to other way of generating procedural content. I just wanted to have a quick break to remind you that the recording of these episodes and many more great conversation with incredible experts are available on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Just head over to my profile or in the episode description below and pick the platform you prefer. And now let's get back to the show.
Yeah, so you mean like generating stuff that aren't worlds, basically, like characters, weapons, stuff like that. Yeah, the problems are a little bit different. Basically, like wave function collapse is good on things that are like grids, grid-based things. Usually a bigger environment can be reasonably turned into a grid. You have to make some compromises with the proportions of some things, and maybe some parts of the natural landscape will look a bit less organic than it would in real life, but that's usually fine. but it's not a great algorithm for very, very organic landscapes, like when you have some hills and stuff. It's not as good with that. But characters and other props like weapons and vehicles, it doesn't work as well with those because those are not as grid based, right? They have some parts they need to have, like a character mostly needs to be symmetric, for example. And if it picks one type of ear on one side, it should probably have the same type of ear on the other side. Those kind of things. I've worked with other types of procedural generation a lot, like Bad North has procedurally generated characters, for example, but they use a very different system, though it's similar in the way that it's still very content based. So it's based in the characters in Bad North. It's based on me like handcrafting all the little pieces, and through the data structure of those pieces, the algorithm kind of interprets how they're supposed to fit together. So it kind of, so it's slightly more complex than just picking a random eye and a random ear and a random nose. But yeah, depending on what type of environment or what type of thing you're making, you probably need different kind of procedural algorithms. Okay. But there are, like, Wave Fudger Collapse is a type of algorithm called constraint. It's a constraint-based algorithm. Like, it's basically it's like, here are all the options, and it tries to find a coherent solution given those options. And there are other constraint-based type algorithms you can use for other problems as well. And I think it's a fairly nice approach because you can make it very content-driven. Like, you give it, once you've got the algorithm down, you try out giving it different types of content, and it figures out how to create something out of those types of content.
Yeah. And correct me if I'm wrong at some point, right? And this is kind of like the type of symbolic AI, right? When you try to kind of like try to find an end state for a series of circumstances, right? Now, I was wondering if you have thought of using generative AI as part of that creative process. Not to replace it, but maybe adding element of generative AI, for example, to the textures or to other things that could be part of that. What are your thoughts on that? Is that something you've experimented with?
I haven't really experimented with it so far. No, I don't have that much expertise in the area as well. Like theoretically, I think there are interesting ways you could use it. I think, like what you said about textures is a really is one good place. Like, imagine if I created if I created a world using the kind of techniques I've been using so far, wave function, and maybe the textures that I hand author contain a bunch of semantics, like here's supposed to be a wall, and here's supposed to be a window, those kind of things. And then a generative AI later gets to do a pass over all the texturing and add little details and just make everything fit together a little bit better. I think theoretically for those kind of things, it could potentially work very well. Right now, I'm working on a project that contains a lot more organic landscapes. And for those kind of things, I think, like, theoretically, again, it could look very cool. It could potentially work. I don't really know. Like, so far, the things I've been making were supposed to work on weak platforms that we talked about before, and I don't know how it would be to, like, run those things live on a phone, for example, or of course there's also with the AI question, there's also, like, the copyright question and the ethical question of, like, is it possible to make your own system like that's not trained on copyrighted data so you can use it yourself in your game live? I don't know. I haven't looked into it enough.
Right. And so maybe since you brought it up, these some of your recent project, I've seen those, that turning sphere globe getting populated with landscapes, textures, again, as you mentioned, lighting. Going back to what was the previous question, in a way, have you figured out the gameplay yet, or are you still at the technical?
I do have an idea for gameplay, but I'm not prepared to share it publicly yet. I'm working with another person who I I think would also not want to be disclosed publicly yet. And he has opinions on when we can start sharing stuff about the game.
We will keep it very secret then.
Yeah.
So keep up with the let's say technical experimentation on Oskar X account. But I want to go to another point. That's what actually drove me first into Townscaper, and what was the VR port. So there is, I really love it because I think it seems like a game that was made to be played in VR in a way, and that's not common, especially when you port something that goes on flat screen first. And there was a lot of stuff that I enjoyed and that I imagined require adaptation. For example, the locomotion mechanic, right? How do you move in space? How do you change color of pieces? Right? That is a very unique system that you could have relied instead on just a dial with a colored thing. Well, instead you have those little bubbles that go on the pointer that you select, and you can cycle through the different colors. And there are all these things, right? As well, of course, as the optimization of the own game, as you mentioned. So what are some of the things that you had to optimize, and maybe how did you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, so there were a bunch of technical optimizations, but it was kind of the same method we had to do for mobile anyway. So this like moving some things from a pixel shader to a vertex shader, stuff like that. But yeah, as you said, the big thing about VR is the interaction is completely different. It's completely different from touch or controller and mouse and keyboard. So I kind of went. That was sort of the fun part about making a VR switch, the VR port, because it's not a super explored area, and there's like people do very different things for interaction. Like one weird thing I have in Townscaper is these little stalks, little like grabber claws at the end of and because I started with thinking about the movement like you do on a touchscreen. You know, when you move a map on your phone, you pinch it with your fingers and you move around, and it's super intuitive. So I tried that at first, but then I realized like it was so at first you just grabbed onto the whole world with your hands, but then you got really tired in your shoulders after a bit because you had to move like your whole hands to do things. But then if you have the stalks, you can do a lot of just like moving your wrist a little bit to create and it's a very intuitive. You understand straight away that this little claw on the edge, that's where you grab onto. Yeah. Yeah, so it was I'm pretty happy with that solution. And then it's the little beads, they kind of fit into it because there was it was fairly natural to show the color that you would build with at the end of the stalk, at the end of the claw, and then you might as well have the little beads as well. But I figured, like, in general, an interesting thing with VR that's very different from other platforms is that, like, for example, I on the control, in my game, on the controllers, I simply write a little letter on the controller or a little label that says what it does, like what does a different button do. Because in a normal game, or in a flat screen, that will clutter the UI quite a lot if you have little text things everywhere that says what every button does. So normally you have stuff like hover instead. So when you hover the pointer or something, it will show. But in VR, the thing is that normally you just don't hold the controllers in your face. But then if you do, why not have a label there? And it can be very small because you could just bring it closer to your face and read it there. So it's a very interesting, very different way of doing it. And then I figured you can actually put quite a lot there because, right, I have the menus on like the arms as well, or they kind of like if you fold out your hand, you see the menus and stuff. So it's also an interesting, like, instead of clicking some button that opens a menu, why not just have like there's a whole like gesture space that you could and not because it's very different to the types of, like, there's a lot of VR stuff that tries to do gestures with like things you do with your hands or like swipe around in the air and stuff. And those, I think, they tend to be quite vague. Like you don't get, like, a button is nice because when you click a button, you feel like you click a button, you know where it is. It's clear that you're doing something.
I totally agree, because my other question is, since Townscaper is a fairly simple game, I mean, to play, there aren't like tons of interaction or something like that. Have you considered doing hand interaction, for example, since it's so simple, that might be easy to implement or not?
We did talk about it when because I didn't do this port all by myself. I got help with from my publisher Raw Fury. So we did talk about hands, and I think Meta did want would have liked us to do hands as well. But maybe that's gotten better now. But at least when I developed it, I didn't feel like the hand like using the hands felt very good. It didn't have it felt a little bit floaty, a little bit like you didn't have that like super good control, and also doing different things like doing a click that was simple, sort of. It usually worked, but doing more like with a controller, you have a couple of buttons you can work with.
Yeah.
So in hat, if you were using hands, you would need to offload all those buttons to menus or stuff.
And and this is another point where everybody always says, "No, VR is going to be intuitive only when we have hands. Everything is with hands." I still disagree, because I think that true, you probably need to learn the couple of buttons that you need to learn, but otherwise, interacting with hands is also requires a lot of knowledge, because you cannot put UI on hands, and the functions that buttons can do, being left, right, the thumbstick,
Oh,
can substitute a lot of other learning that you need to do with hands. That is
no,
also, I think, pretty tricky. So I would say that there is an argument that hands interaction is not necessarily the most intuitive. There are probably better experience, and I think that especially the creative experience would likely usually benefit from controllers in any shape
yeah,
or form. That's
yeah,
a bit my feel.
yeah. I think I mean, you've got this sort of spectrum where like PC is where most people do productive work, and then you've got a whole keyboard and mouse and everything. And those are they're quite big, like they take a lot of space, but they are very precise. You've got lots of options on the keyboard. You can learn to type super fast. Um, so if you would be able to do like professional creative work on a VR headset, you need quite a lot of input to be able to do stuff fast. You need like the equivalent of shortcuts. Like you can't otherwise you can't like if you
No. Otherwise, your whole view is gonna cover by buttons, drop down
exactly
menus,
yeah, or you
and
have to
stuff.
learn like 100 gestures that are just like slightly different in how you hold your hand.
Yeah, I don't know.
So
I always compare it. People don't know. Have you ever watched Naruto?
no,
So in Naruto, it's like this ninja, and they always make these weird poses to make
no,
stuff happen with their
well,
hands. So it is a bit like that in a way.
no,
Sometimes I feel.
yes.
Townscaper on VR has been out for quite a while now, right?
Mm.
And I was wondering if you did the port, having some sort of expectation of any sort, right? It could be financial, it could be community response. Did you have those expectations? Have they been met?
Well, I don't know what kind of. I kind of did the port because I figured it would be fun to. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, I think Meta reached out to us and asked if we wanted to do a port with some kind of deal, which I'm probably not allowed to say too much about, though I don't know. Um, and yeah, actually, like a couple of months just after I shipped Townscaper, like on PC before it was on, I didn't consider VR. Meta just sent me a headset as a gift, so I assumed they were kind of hinting that I should make a VR version at some point. Um, but no, I just figured it would be a fun thing to try out, basically, and we got a good deal for it. I didn't really expect it to be like a I mean, I think it was a good financial idea just because of the deal, but I didn't expect it to be a big seller, for example. So it
On
was,
VR? Yeah.
yeah, on VR, yeah. Yeah, no, I think it was just, I had this idea of wanting to bring Townscaper to all kinds of things, which I did. Like it's on PC, mobile, Switch, Xbox, and yeah, there's even the web version. So I figured it would be fun to have a VR version in there as well.
By the way, for everybody listening, I'm gonna add the web version so anybody can try anywhere,
Yeah.
right? I think it's still, and then of course get it for VR or for PC, because you can do more, you can build bigger areas, for sure. I do have a couple more questions before we close, and one is, you have been building in public now for years, right? So, what are the things that you have learned, and what are the advices that you could give to others indies or small team that are pushing their game out there?
Yeah. Um, I mean, I've been building in public for a long time. I do it partly because I don't. I I work either by myself or in a very small team, and it's just a good way to get sort of more eyes on a project, to see, um, get not really feedback, but well, sometimes feedback, but usually just to see like what kind of things do people respond to. Both so that you have a sense of like, am I going in the right direction? Should I keep developing more of this kind of stuff? Or like, do people, I thought that this was really cool, but no one's really reacting to it. So maybe it's not as cool as I thought. And also to get a sense of like, what are the coolest parts of your game? What are the parts that you should be using more when it's time to do like proper marketing? Like, does the combat look great? Are you always getting good reactions for that? Maybe that's, then you should put more of that in your trailer or whatever. But also it's a really good way just professionally to meet other developers. I've developed friendships through Twitter. A lot of friends that I've met in real life later on. You get tips on like if you're trying to do something, other people who have done similar things before will comment and say like, "Oh, I did it this way," or "I did it that way," and you get good tips on stuff. Yeah, and it's sort of I mean, for me, it's also worked as a marketing thing for my games. Um, and it's been a fairly low effort way of doing that. Because usually, I when I'm developing some kind of new feature, algorithm, or something interesting, when I feel like it's getting done or getting at least coming to a state where it's kind of cool, I just make a little GIF out of it. Because I usually, if it's an algorithm, I usually also have some cool like. I've built some debug visualization stuff as I'm making it, so it's already quite presentable. So then I could just make a little GIF on it and put on Twitter, and it kind of serves as marketing as well. So it's a fairly low effort way of doing kind of marketing on the fly.
But what do you think is stopping other indies, or maybe again, it's people working in a small team, to do that more often? Because I do feel that sometimes a lot is kept, and because nothing is ever presentable enough. I mean,
Clear.
that I feel is sometimes one of the things that's stopping. But what have you seen that, again, indeed, to encourage
Yeah.
people to do it more often?
I mean, I think there are a lot of people who do share, especially in the indie game sphere. There's a lot of people who do share their development. But it depends on what kind of game you're making. If you're making something, my games tend to look very presentable in a short GIF, for example. So they work very well on social media, on Twitter. But other games, like if you're making a more story heavy game, for example, that doesn't work nearly as well. And then it might be important to not have like spoilers and stuff. Or if you're making like a complex strategy game, like it might be a really fun and interesting game, but it might not look so cool in a small video still. I mean, you should probably, make the art better so it does look cool in a screenshot or GIF anyway. But it's kind of depends on my.
I would argue that sometimes it also depends how even that little GIF is packaged, because even something that might look in a way still kind of like boring, or maybe not necessarily that polished, could maybe framed in a little angle, told a little story around it, and still add that, of course, something that looks better, something that is more appealing for a short form type of content. Of course, it's going to resonate more. But that, I don't think, shouldn't stop people from getting a close up of an animation of a character that is like maybe just showing something, right?
Yeah.
So I think that there might be different ways of repurposing or using the content that you have built to make something that looks good on camera for 10-15 seconds, because that's what we are talking about.
And I think people kind of like work in progress shots as well. People like seeing a bit behind the scenes, and like I always, if I make, I like doing GIFs with like editor camera movements. I'm just moving around the editor camera, and you see the mouse cursor as well, because it kind of makes it clear that this is in this this is in an editor. It's like it's not done yet.
Exactly. This is another point. The actual making of things is what people really like, because it's like they can learn, he's sharing, maybe she is being vulnerable about it, and it's a story, and maybe I can follow this story because, hey, oh, this looks cool, follow, and then they're gonna see that story evolving. So I think it's a very good point, showing in editor view. I think it's very powerful. It could be very powerful.
Yeah.
Oskar, I wanted to thank you very much. So I've heard you just said that you cannot disclose much about that sphere planets that you're building. When can we expect something from your side? Can you give us maybe some timelines?
Oh God, I have no idea. Depends on how it goes. It's kind of a different type of game than what I've done before. It's the procedural generation part is, of course, it's sort of a big part of what I'm bringing to the table, and that's not too different from what I've done before. So I'll keep posting those kind of things. But the whole game, apart from that, is a little bit different, a little bit bigger gameplay wise than what I'm used to. So it kind of depends how well that comes together. I feel a little bit uncertain in when I'm building like the core gameplay architecture, which is a lot of what I'm trying to do now. So we'll see. I mean, definitely within 1, 2, 3 years, definitely you'll see something.
That's a pretty broad spectrum. I think that many people will follow the journey along. I'm pretty sure there is always something to learn, something to be let's say excited about. So Oskar, thank you very, very much for sharing this journey about Townscaper, procedural generation, and everything else. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening in. If you like the show, please leave a rating on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or a thumbs up on YouTube. It really means a lot to me, and it's a great support for the show. Till next time.